Hello, welcome everyone. We're very excited to have you for this session on cross-border learning practical lessons from the U.S. migration Frontlines. I'm Christina Antonakis Wallace here with the Belonging Beyond Borders Network moderating today. And our partners that made this event possible are With Wings and Roots, the Gorilla Foundation, Building Belonging, and European Philanthropic Initiative for Migration. So on behalf of all of us, welcome. We're really excited to get started and dig into this rich conversation with Emilia González Avalos from Unidos MN and Silky Shah from the Detention Watch Network. So why are we here today? We are in a very scary moment. It is bigger than migration. It is bigger than one issue. We have sprawling wars that are rippling around the world, and there's always the most acute effects somewhere. As with migration, the most acute effect might be migrants, refugees themselves, but then there are the ripple effects of how this is eroding democratic norms, and we have the folks in Iran, in Gaza, in certain parts of the world that are getting targeted right now, who are directly on the front lines, and then many of us who are feeling the ripple effects of this militarism and violence that is corrosive to our social well-being and our ecological well-being. So we're here because migration is the wedge issue that is being weaponized. Not the only one. There are others, obviously, especially around trans rights, but migration is the big issue being weaponized to undermine democratic norms around the world. And in the US, we've seen that not just lead to the targeting of migrants, but also the murder of citizens who are acting in community defense and protest. And so I think there's been a level of escalation that we've seen that is requires an escalation of our own resistance, coordination, tactics, and principled strategy. And I think the headlines of many of the horrible things that are happening in the US make the news, but the actual successful organizing work that's happening on the ground rarely makes the news, and we know that. And so that's part of why it felt like a great opportunity to actually, through this network, Belonging Beyond Borders, bring some of the lessons that are already being learned, because we know that the strategies that are being tested out here are being replicated in other parts of the world and having ripple effects. So that's why we're here. I would love to introduce our two speakers. Emilia González Avalos is the executive director of Unidos Minneapolis. She is an immigrant born in Mexico City and raised in Minnesota, who's had her career organizing low-wage workers, migrants, and communities towards social and economic justice. As the executive director of Unidos, she's transformed what began as an undocumented student-led network to a statewide Latino powerhouse, organizing with meat packers, service, construction, and janitorial workers and their families across the state. When ICE enforcement intensified in Minnesota, Emilia led the rapid mobilization and training of thousands of residents, becoming one of the most visible and effective organizers on the frontline community defense. And Silky Shah has been working as an organizer on the issues of racial and migrant justice for 2 decades. She began fighting the expansion of immigrant detention on the US-Mexico border in the aftermath of 9/11, long before it became the kind of publicly discussed crisis that it is today. In 2009, she joined Detention Watch Network, which she now leads, a national coalition building power to abolish criminal immigrant detention in the United States. Organizing against the contracts, infrastructure, and capital flows that make mass detention possible. She's also a writer and has been published in many publications and has authored the book Unbuild Walls: Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition. So thank you both. Before I have them introduce themselves and jump into their work, I want to share one resource for you all, which is something that kind of was the impetus for us doing this today, which is a memo that we put together that was mapping what are the different organizing tactics that are working in the US right now. So, and there were just a few key takeaways, which are going to come up in the shares from Silky and Emilia. So we'll get a chance to talk more about these things. But I just want you to know, in addition to hearing from Silky and Emilia today, there's a memo that you can download that has kind of an overview of different tactics people are using right now, from accompanying people to court, to deportation defense, to organizing at the municipal level, what is working right now and what people are doing. So some of the kind of takeaways are that visible resistance really creates a friction and causes problems for immigration enforcement. And that's not just ICE, which you've heard a lot about, but there are a number of agencies collaborating right now for immigration enforcement. We might call them ICE as shorthand because it's easier than naming all of the acronyms. That enforcement really depends on infrastructure. So infrastructure can be contested, and that can come through contracts, zoning, surveillance system, capital flows. These are leverage points. They're not just background conditions that go uncontested. These are things that we can actually organize around. That cross-status solidarity is essential. That those with greater legal protection need to take higher risk roles, and that risk needs to be distributed, not ignored. And that culture really expands who can participate in our movements. So whether that's song, humor, signage, mutual aid, these are strategies that are really bringing wider swaths of the public into our movements. So those are a few takeaways. I would encourage you to download that memo and share it with folks and see if there's more information in there. But with that, I'd like to go ahead and invite Emilia, if you would be open to start by sharing just a couple minutes about um, what brings you to this work. Because after that, I'm going to start asking some questions about really the mechanics of the work. So this doesn't have to be about that. This is just what brings you to it.
Thank you, Christina. Well, first of all, I'm an immigrant. I came to Minnesota when I was a young child. I was 11, 12 years old when I joined my father in Minnesota, and he came to the United States to find better work conditions. My father, my uncles, my grandparents are all construction workers. The women in the family are obreras, or they work in the sweatshops like sewing, creating, like sewing for by big maquiladoras, like the big factories that create the clothes in Mexico. And so my father heard about this very cold place that pays a little better than California. And so he joined to Minnesota. He came to Minnesota, and he was told that if he could endure a couple winters, that he will be set. And so he arrived to Minnesota. I joined him a few years later. My siblings and my mother stayed in Mexico. And growing up there, truly like, shaped uh, my my experiences. I was undocumented. I didn't have access to different services and goods. This was before the DREAM Act or policies for young undocumented people will be implemented. And so I worked in essential jobs to be able to help them send money back. And I was able to experience and witness the conditions in which essential workers that keep this country going, that are the main reason why people can have food in this country, where they can have goods and services, who builds this country with their hands and their labor every day, are so mistreated in the workplace and in the policies. And so I dedicated my time, my commitment, my effort to move forward with this community, not just with success, personal success or personal title, but like I'm moving in community for all of us to have better conditions everywhere.
Thanks so much, Amelia. Silky, can you come on in and share a little bit about what brings you to this work?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's really wonderful to be on with Amelia as well. I was born and raised in Texas, in Houston, Texas. I'm from an Indian immigrant family, and I was a student around 9/11 and living in Texas and seeing sort of the impact of um, the post 9/11 period on South Asian immigrants, Arab Muslim immigrants, but also, at like actually mostly who bore the brunt of that experience were Latinos, Mexicans in Texas in particular. And what was happening at that period of time was there was a very large sort of prison boom happening at the border. And as Christina was talking about, like a lot of infrastructure being built. And so a lot of the reason why I come to this work, I like growing up in Texas, learning about the role of, you know, the criminal legal system, mass incarceration, the death penalty was very active in Texas. There was a lot of efforts to stop that whenever I was a student, and then sort of seeing those intersections between how the US, which is the world's leading incarcerator and has this, massive scale of prisons and policing, how that sort of growth of that ended up applying even more and more to immigrant populations and seeing these systems as kind of fully intertwined. So a lot of the reason I come to the work and a lot of the reason we do this work at Detention Watch Network is both, you know, detention is completely inhumane. It's we don't believe people should be detained for their immigration status, and in general, and come from a very abolitionist perspective. But the other thing is that the way that the US has committed so much to incarceration is very like obsessed with punishment. The way that it's kind of operated is that having more detention capacity actually just leads to much more deportation. And so there is a correlation between the incarceration and the act of deportation. And so that's a lot of the reason why we focus on immigration detention and why it's, uh, I've been working on this for over 20 years, which, in this context, it's been sort of both wild to see. I've really struggled with how incredibly um, massive and violent the system has become in this last year, but I've also been incredibly inspired by how much people are seeing it more clearly now, and I'm hopeful that we can push back even more.
Well, maybe we can just start with you, Silky, and then we'll come to Emilia, which is maybe you could talk a little bit about the mechanics of what it actually means to organize against um, detention facilities and prisons, because I think a lot of people can't even imagine how you would get one of these facilities shut down. But Watch Network has actually been able to organize to actually close existing facilities in addition to prevent new facilities from being built in the first place. So how do you guys work? What does your model kind of look like? And I know you work with a lot of partners, so you can describe that there's a range, but yeah.
Yeah. So Detention Watch Network next year will be our 30th anniversary. Um, and we came together in 1997. I wasn't around then, but um, in response to really harsh laws that were passed in Congress called the 1996 immigration laws. There's, a lot to be said about those, but it was a moment where things started to really shift where you know, detention expanded considerably. More and more people were subject to it, especially people who had contact with the criminal legal system and people who are recently arriving in the US. And since then that has evolved even more, and now we're kind of in this place where we've accepted that so much that it's applying to even larger populations. And so our network, and there's folks here who are from our network, includes people who are like large policy organizations like ACLU, American Civil Liberties um, yeah, Union, and then like Amnesty International, but then totally grassroots organizations that don't have a lot of funding, statewide organizations, lawyers organizations, people doing immigrant legal service provision, and also people themselves who have been in detention. And so we really see our approach as very multi-pronged. So there's a lot of attention in the US, especially on litigation strategies. We don't do that. We don't do like a ton of work in the courts, but a lot of our work is focused on advocacy at the local, state, and federal level and organizing with grassroots communities, and then also narrative work, which I think is, one of our biggest challenges we can talk about more as we get into the conversation. And so in the last like decade or so, a lot of our approach, and especially learning from a sort of like abolitionist approach, we use sort of abolition as a lens that helps us see not just, I think before we kind of took on an abolitionist approach, we often lent ourselves to like reformist things like how do we make conditions better? How do we have alternatives to detention, which ended up just sort of expanding the scope of who was under some form of government surveillance or incarceration. And once we started to shift, we really thought about it as, actually like this isn't okay. This isn't okay for anyone. So how do we go after specific detention centers where we're in community and people are understanding sort of that connection to the community, how that's targeting more people in community, the violence inside, the inhumane conditions, and this sort of like political economy. I think abolition's a really important place to understand that political economy around incarceration. And then, our strategies we're looking at like local actors, like the county councils or county commissioners or city councils had a role in all of this, and whether it's zoning or having contracts with immigration and customs enforcement at the state level, passing, bills to say, actually, we don't want any detention in this state, which was hugely important in places like Illinois, where there was a surge moment where we had less, like there wasn't detention. So yes, people were being detained, but the scale of what was happening was less because of these wins in the past that Christina was mentioning. And so I think, that has been really important, but part of our, strategy is also looking at the federal level, because if we're just fighting at the local level, then it ends up being a game of whack-a-mole where we're just trying to like stop one place, but maybe there's a new detention center going somewhere else. And so we were really looking at the federal budget. So much of this, again, is about the infrastructure that Christina was mentioning and about the money that is going into this. And in my mind, in the last year, one of the worst things that happened under this Trump administration was the $170 billion that was dedicated to immigration enforcement in a bill that was passed last summer. And so they have so much money and they're just sort of like throwing it at everything. And so our job is to really say, no, they don't need to use this money. They can't use this money. Like, how do we make sure that more of this infrastructure isn't built? Because what we've learned, especially from people doing work against mass incarceration, is that once it's built, then it's really hard to take down. And in fact, like pretty much all the detention centers in the country, there's very few that were built to be detention centers. Most of them are former prisons or existing county jails. And so I think for us, a lot of this is like, how do we block that infrastructure as we in this moment, it's harder to shut down facilities. So a lot of it is about blocking and using that approach. Again, working with grassroots communities and you know, we don't have we can't work with this administration, obviously, but trying to make sure that we are kind of at the multi-pronged approach, but also like looking at different levels so we don't risk that, we're going to lose on one front while we're kind of gaining on another. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Silky. And I would have follow-up questions for you right now, but I know we also want to start to hear from Emilia about the amazing work that she's been leading in Minnesota. So maybe, Emilia, folks saw Minneapolis, St. Paul in the news around the world, but how much they actually understood what was happening on the ground, of course, is another thing because what the news covers is always very, very limited. So definitely would welcome both just like a little bit of context of what it felt like to be in Minneapolis and what was happening in addition to how your organizing worked. And I think you were organizing before the surge started. So you didn't jump into gear. You had already been building up infrastructure before. That would be really useful to hear as well.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, I want to apologize. I am in New York City right now, and the hotel rooms in this city are very tiny. And so I don't have anywhere to go but the bed. So like I am taking the call from the bed because there's literally like no space. So anyways, Minnesota has like I think we're privileged, but also we benefit from the generations of infrastructure that has been built by labor and power organizations. And by power organizations, I mean base building organizations. There's an ecosystem of service and legal and advocacy, um, activism, but like base building organizations have a similar theory of change than labor unions, which is like you build a membership and then you ask your question of, I have this membership, what do they want? Do I have the power to get it? And so we're not necessarily an ideological vanguard, even though a lot of us have ideologies that are, solidary and ambitious and influenced by a lot of the work that Silky has mentioned. But in Minnesota, Unidos made the decision to build a base that will deliver material conditions for a population, for a vast majority of the population. And so while we are not an ideological vanguard, we have a very specific role in also inoculating things that are harmful for other communities. And so, for example, we are very immigrant robust. We don't invest necessarily in issues like trans rights or GBLTQ rights or choice. But we have members that will know that their vote on those issues will affect other items of our agenda, and they understand how some of these issues are being utilized to divide and conquer between working communities. And so our base is very diverse. We have a lot of mixed status families. We also have an evangelical program with evangelical churches that are questioning a lot of the solidarity that they had before with mega Republicans with authoritarian governments. They're questioning how their theory of progress and the theology of prosperity has affected their beliefs on Christian values. We also have a relationship and a program in Catholic churches, and we're organizing bishops and priests. And so we are an organization that has moved into very hard to organize bases, because if we don't talk to each other, somebody else will. And so we're choosing to talk to each other and go through the nuance and the complexity of being regular human beings. And so our organizing model is a very Midwest traditional Alinsky, like academy, Midwest academy kind of thing. Like power is people, and organize resources. We do one-to-ones, we have power analysis, we set up agendas, and we take bets. So we have an infrastructure that is charitable on the 501(c)(3) status, but we also have a 501(c)(4) that allows us to move our organizing into different frontiers. But we also build political conditions through PACs and independent expenditures. And so our membership through the different elements that began years ago, we knew that there was an agenda. All of us read the leaked memos and the intention to polarize trans people, women, and immigrants in some type of utility to pursue and execute an authoritarian government. And so the mass deportation, even though it's bringing billions of dollars to the 1%, is a utility to deliver an authoritarian regime. The same with the anti-Muslim, anti-Somali narrative in Minnesota. It is a tool to deliver that regime. And so people have to understand what's the share analysis and have to have onboarding ramps so that they can grow in their leadership. And so in our model of organizing leadership development and being very curious and inquisitive about what's holding people back is we spend just a lot of time doing that. After the election, we run analysis and scenarios. We had a plan A in case we will have a continuum of liberal democracy, right? Like we can marry anybody, but we cannot afford healthcare. Like what are the consequences of liberal democracy? And then we run scenarios in case we had to break in case of emergency. And so we broke in case of emergency. And so we decided to align and be very curious about what would a hybrid of very institutional, rigorous organizing that has a tradition in Minnesota will look like when you're trying to distribute on-ramps of leadership across the board for regular people that have perhaps never been involved. And so that's how we deploy Monarca. And it's our constitutional observer program where we did not lecture people on what to do. And like we had legal counsel, and we work with a lot of the lawyer partners in Minnesota on how to deliver this. But then we had a challenge. Lawyers are predominantly risk averse. How are we going to advise people on not take risk? Leadership, encourage, and organizing requires risk taking. What are the risks that we're going to take to advance our agenda, to advance our issues? And so there was a point in about 2023 where we were like, we just have to see other people. And so the legal organizations developed their own rapid response that had all the regular things that lawyers do, like stay 5 feet away, do not do this, a lot of do not do's. And then we deploy this Litterful on-ramp where we emotionally help people rehearse the conditions of what a violent deployment of or force will look like. We look a lot of what border towns have been telling us. Once the Patriot Act was passed, there could be a moment in which the borders will be everywhere. And people in power could use their discretion to bring this vitriol and in massive numbers if they had the budget, which they did. And so we emotionally rehearse with regular people to make choices. If you can record, what do you need to know? Will you record or not? Will you document? Will you bear witness? If you want to slow the operation, what are the consequences? If you want to help your immigrant neighbors and interrupt the operation, what are the consequences? Emotionally rehearse these scenarios, show them what has happened in other places, and then allow them to make a choice. What are you going to do based on these values, based on the stakes, knowing that we don't have that much time? If we don't do not stop the consolidation of authoritarianism, and we actually develop a deep, meaningful reform that meets people's in crisis, that their everyday crisis, we might be in this or even worse consolidation sooner rather than later. So, what is the decisions that you need to do as a regular person? How are you going to show up? And what you saw were thousands of people making a clear choice, deciding to lead, coming to the streets, and organizing others in that drumbeat together. And so it was. It was. I did not know that that was going to happen. You're trained as an organizer to believe in people's potential, and I am a believer. I do believe in that. There's the world stops when a worker makes a choice about challenging whomever is oppressing them in any given time. If they make a choice about talking to 5 people so they can go and talk to the boss about the stolen wages, the world stops right there for me. Those are the moments that I live for. And those are the choices people got to make right now, but also that they made in Minnesota months ahead of time before we had this massive deployment of violent force.
Whew. It's so powerful, Amelia, and it has been so powerful, was so powerful to watch so many people in Minnesota come together and demonstrate what solidarity really looks like and really articulate for the nation. Organizing that was already happening all over the country, but bring it into a kind of a collective body in a way that really we hadn't seen yet. And I'm sure that attributes so much to the legacy of organizing that was already there, but also the incredible work that you and others have been doing. So just thank you for being that beacon of hope for us in a very challenging time. Where have you seen the work that you guys are doing actually shift the outcomes? How has the work you've been doing actually changed the direction? Because I think sometimes that's really hard for folks who are not part of the work to see and understand. And either of you who are feeling called can jump in.
I mean, I guess I just want to like there's so much about like last year it's been incredibly hard. There's no like getting around how difficult this round of the Trump administration has been. And but I mean, Minnesota really blew it all up because I think exactly what Amelia and Christina you were just talking about, like in organizing, we're often told that the only reason people are going to engage in this work is that if they have some sort of material connection to the issue. And I think what was so powerful about Minnesota was no, actually, this is about solidarity. This is about people showing up for their neighbors and their community, and maybe neighbors and community that they don't actually know yet. Um, and I do think again, understanding like what does this massive expansion of these systems portend? Where does it go? And the way that fascism operates is through law enforcement, and I think that's something that understanding it as ICE, but also understanding those connections between all the various law enforcement agencies is really important. So, in terms of this question around effectiveness and what's been possible, is actually, in the last period of time when we were very successful at actually getting detention center contracts ended and started to see a reduction was a very sort of conjunctural moment. And what was happening, this was in 2020, 2021, and a few things were happening. One, like we had many years of the Trump administration and this sort of like fear mongering and violence against immigrant communities that people were not thrilled about, right? And then two, we had like a global pandemic that started to help people see that actually having these institutional settings could actually is not good for public health. It's like actually quite bad to have people be in these settings where you can grow a virus more and more. And it was like these were hotbeds of infection essentially. And so there was like that question. And then you had the summer of 2020 when in Minneapolis again, and I do think this was such an important moment for some of that infrastructure you were talking about, Emilia, being built. You started to see, the culmination of many years of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the uprisings for Black lives after the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police, and other stories emerging like Breonna Taylor and people. And it was a catalyst moment. People started to really dig deep into, mass incarceration, in racist policing, and all these other sort of systems of control in the US that lead to Black men, especially, being killed by police regularly, right? Like that was a really core part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it helped us open up space to make the case against immigration detention because we could then, as people had this sort of like racial reckoning, they could understand the relationship between those systems of control and what was happening with immigration. And it was easier for them to get to this place of actually, maybe we shouldn't detain people. There was another story out of detention center in Georgia, the Irwin County Detention Center, where it emerged that there had been forced hysterectomies and other gynecological procedures on women who were detained there. And that was like another catalyst moment. And so part of the way that I thought about it, and for many years, we had been building up work through our Communities Not Cages campaign, and our work to defund hate, this defund ICE and CBP, ICE and Customs and Border Protection strategy. And we were really ready to go. And we were like, okay, like we have folks on the ground who are ready to go. We're gonna like this is the moment to make the case for abolition. And a lot of a lot of people started to get on board in a way they hadn't before. And many more states started passing laws against immigration detention. We have 7 states now that have passed laws against immigration detention, or 8 actually, because New Mexico just passed it not too long ago. So 8 states, and localities were saying we don't want to have these contracts with ICE. They like so much about this is understanding the system. And that's what has made us more effective is like, where can we throw wrenches in this system to make it so people aren't targeted? And so much of this is about targeting, but like again, it's about infrastructure. If they have 20,000 ICE agents now. This is part of the reason they could do what they attempted to do in Minneapolis with 3,000 ICE agents on the ground. But they're actually, like you have movement like this block them, and then you don't have actually a lot of detention capacity in Minnesota. That makes it harder for them to do the scale of what they want to do. And this was true in Illinois as well. And so I think that to me is a really key part of how we're effective is like, how are we ready for this moment, those moments when people like start to really question the system? Are we doing that? Sort of Ella Baker talks about spade work. Like, how are we really prepared as organizers, as the movement, and knowing what the answer is for people actually? And one of the things that happened after the murders of Alex Preddy and Renee Good in Minneapolis is that it was the time of the like there was funding conversations in Congress around Department of Homeland Security funding. And we were able to make the case that actually not just don't fund ICE, which we won on, which was incredible, but also, and they held for for several months on that. But also, we made the case like claw back some of that funding that was promised last summer that I was talking about before. And Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders, actually introduced an amendment that said, let's take 75 billion of this money that for immigration enforcement and put it back into Medicaid, into healthcare here in the US. And so then it helps people like make those connections. And again, that was like many years of doing work around appropriations. And here was a moment where people were like seeing how harmful these systems are and when we could make the case. And so I think it's being prepared for those moments and really understanding these systems much more clearly so we can see how to intervene.
Thanks, Silky. I'm just mindful of the time, so I want to invite you in with that question, Emilia, but I can't tell if questions are also populating from folks in the room somewhere as well. Um, Maybe we can start taking questions in the chat because I know we're not going to have time for all the questions that are up, but maybe you could just jump in there. Emilia, what have you seen actually shift? What have been some of the outcomes of the organizing that you're doing that may be the visible ones and also some of the invisible ones that are going to last well beyond this moment?
So it is a battle of narrative and infrastructure versus narrative and infrastructure. And so the groundwork of the authoritarian administration had been to plow Minnesota on anti-Muslim, anti-Somali narrative, especially in terms of fraud, and connecting that to the dysfunction of a government. And so you have this triage of narrative talking points that include mistrust of government, racial tension, and economic resentment working together to create the ground for an authoritarian regime to invest in the opportunity to seize power for the people that already have it. And so this solidarity was able to not just bring to light the erosion of constitutional rights that the enforcement of ICE, the kidnaps of people, the erosion of immigrants' constitutional rights, but also the violence that they were bringing to the streets, the displays of militarized violence, military grade, war grade surveillance systems that brought to the regular streets of Minnesota. And so the massive infrastructure of constitutional observers was able to bring that and punch holes and crack the narrative of Somali Muslim fraud. How like the scapegoat, yes, it is visibly who looks more different than a white Anglo-Saxon and how we're gonna keep polarizing them to keep them distracted and fulfill passing all these budget items and continue to bring contractors into the enforcement side while doing the deep economic reforms that will work for the wealthy few. Like in this moment that Silky was talking about the budget of the Department of Homeland Security, we also were feeling in the body of regular people the divestment of social fabrics, of food systems, of healthcare systems, and then continue to tell us, but this is not because the government has this inflated budget for militarization. It is because Somalis are taking all the money. And so the organizing was able to crank up, crack the narrative, and then put in the view of everyone and the world what was really happening in terms of solidarity and supporting one another in places like Minnesota. That helped us shift and model for regular people that truly people power has more potential than authoritarian control, because there are only a few. They do have money, they do have guns, but we have people. We have people. And when people take risks together, we can definitely shift the course of a town, of a country, and a nation. I also think that we are shifting into democracy protection. The shift into democracy protection, into making sure that this country actually gets to carry free and fair elections, and the people that are elected actually get to take a seat, have enabled us to think about a trajectory of organizing arc from right now until March, as a next stage of the organizing. We already know that Tom Homan is telling everybody that they're going to come back to the urban towns where we have sanctuary policies. They have already announced that there's all these illegal voters, and the 14th Amendment is part of why they have a political opposition. And so they are the being grounded on history, on the history of how we got here. And being grounded, to be honest, we learn a lot from people from other countries, how regular people were able to carry peaceful, massive demonstrations. And then our test looks different because we are in a very, like, it is not the same to organize in places where erosion of constitutional rights are consistently threatening the lives of activists than being in this very sheltered first world country where the progress of the civil rights movement has sheltered First Amendment in some capacity. And so becoming this, being able to see the risks right now, to be grounded in the stakes as real as they are right now, and understanding that the power that this nation has can shift the world is a big task. It is beyond what we can do in our borders. It is about how the rippling effect of authoritarianism in this country will continue to shape war and foreign policy and economic trade in other places. And so if the displacement of people is an issue, there is no interest in solving the displacement. There is an interest in continue to displace people because it continues to create the conditions for cheap labor. And so we gotta be very clear about that. We gotta think about foreign policy. Thank you, Silky, for naming. Yes, we were a ground zero for Black lives in Minnesota. And after the movement, our city government moved to the right. We got a more conservative, neoliberal leadership, and the power of the more progressive city councils and county commissioners was eroded. So we continue, like, we understand that if we don't have our math right, if we are in this pull and push with policies and reforms and system change, we can also go back to worse conditions. And so being clear-eyed about that is also very important in this moment.
Ooh, thank you. So I've seen a couple of questions in the chat. I see Miman has a hand raised. And I also know that we are coming up on the first hour, which is when we wanted to move into breakout sessions. So I'm curious, Silky and Emilia, are you up for 10 more minutes in the plenary? Okay, we're going to stay here for a couple of questions and then we'll go to breakout rooms. Sharon asked a question earlier about collaboration with trade unions, and that's a conversation that she and I've actually been in a little bit. Sharon is doing amazing organizing work in South Africa for migrant workers and refugees in South Africa who are experiencing a lot of xenophobia, and there's not a lot of support from the trade unions. So I'd be curious to hear if either of you have experience working with or not receiving support from trade unions. Could go both directions.
I mean, in Minnesota, Unidos was funded significantly by unions when we were teeny tiny. when we had like 1.2 staff people and we were renting a table in a community center. So SEIU International and SEIU Local 26, SEIU Healthcare, and SEIU 284 were part of how we were trained. I was personally trained by SEIU as a labor organizer first. And that's how we started to grow. They continue to be one of our most important partners, but also has become the nurses union and the teachers union and other unions. Of course, they have to wrestle and challenge racial division in their formation. In Minnesota, still the trades, like the carpenters, my husband is a carpenter, but like the carpenters, the electricians, the pipe fitters, the laborers, there's still a very different racial justice lens that we still continue to wrestle with. But again, if we don't build the opportunities to have a conversation, to organize and build shared interest agendas, somebody else will. And so we go at it, we build with them, we have hard conversations, and sometimes we're not on the same side of issues, especially in climate justice and green work and green labor issues.
Silky,
Yeah,
anything to add about working
I
with
mean,
unions?
I think there's just like, there's Justin Akers Chacon has a book called The Border Process that has a lot of history about the role of labor on immigration, and it's actually quite, it's not great. And I think ultimately, like, it's kind of a mixed bag. Occasionally, it can be really helpful. Like Emilia was saying, we've been working with the National Nurses United, which has taken on a abolish ICE stance, which has been great. And I think for Detention Watch Network, we really see ourselves as like, um, the left flank of the movement. So we're really trying to push the boundaries, which is sometimes harder to do with groups. But we do work with groups like SEIU, and they've actually done really great work around detention. And so it just sort of depends, and it depends also on the conditions. I think in this moment, some people might be willing to go a little further. Under, when Biden was in office, there was like a retreat actually from a lot of groups. And so that's always a challenge.
I'm going to invite Mimon in if you're up for unmuting yourself. Can you hear me?
Uh, am I supposed to ask my question?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Christina. Hi everybody, I'm Iman from Germany. Thank you, Emilia and Silky, for your input and sharing your knowledge. That's so impressive to me. I got a question, and I do not know if it can be answered. I got a feeling that we are here in Germany very far behind the US in organizing communities. But what I'm really struggling with right now is when it comes to organizing people to go out on the streets and for a rally or whatever, and doesn't matter what the reason is, if it is police brutality against black people, if it is whether it is for asylum seekers or whatever, those who are affected are mostly scared to go out on the streets and to stand up for themselves. And if I talk to them, they are always like, yeah, I don't know, there is police and they're making pictures. My pictures might end up in some files and they might use it against me. And is there something that what can be done about it, or is it even that they are actually even right, and I'm trying to do something that might bring them into harm? And I really don't know, because when there are rallies, it's mostly like yeah, how am I supposed to? It's mostly white people who are going out on the streets and demonstrate against police brutality or for the rights of asylum seekers, and but not those who are actually really affected. And that gives like a wrong picture. It shows somehow if those who are not affected are standing up for themselves, then they might not care about it. But that is not what it is. And is there something that can be done? Is there something you can give me as an something that I can do about it?
It's been a real challenge in the US, I'll say, because in the years that actually led to some relief for immigrant communities, so especially in um, the years that the President Obama was in office, there was actually like so much of the movement was especially around immigrant youth who were coming out of the shadows, like learning from the queer movements and saying we're undocumented, we're unafraid, we are going to stand up for ourselves. And they pushed the bounds of what could happen, and that led to Obama implementing administrative relief, like some sort of legal status for immigrant youth, especially, which of course is being challenged now. But there was a lot of efforts around that really coming from immigrant community that felt that they could were ready to sort of have like exercise their agency. But I think this last year has been so challenging because, it's a combination of the fact that we spent so many years of the narratives around good immigrants versus bad immigrants and old immigrant versus new immigrants that we've gotten to this point where this administration is like all immigrants are bad. And so now everybody is a lot more at risk. I think one of the challenges is that people need to have a better understanding of risk assessment for themselves, and that helps kind of determine then like what you could go to a rally. Do you need to get arrested? Maybe not. I mean, I think a lot of this comes up, especially around travel for people in the US. And so those are things we're kind of considering. But the reality is, and I think one of the challenges sometimes there is this perspective, and I've experienced this with the immigrant rights movement, where it's like, the people who do this work have to be the people who are directly impacted. I'm like, well, if it's only the people who are directly impacted, we're probably going to lose because we actually really need more than just those people. We need like more and yes, we need leadership from communities who are directly impacted, and we need to but we need to make sure that we create on-ramps for people outside of community. So it might be frustrating to go to a rally, and I've experienced this there's these No Kings protests here, and it's definitely like an experience of like this is all white folks who are here. But at the same time, like what are we doing to do that political education with people to make sure they understand these systems better, and then doing the work to like protect our communities and make it so that we do get to the conditions where people can feel more free to be exercising their agency again.
Yeah, I agree with everything Silky said. What we experience that we have a lot of our members who have one incredible policy, including expanding healthcare to undocumented folks in Minnesota, and like great wins like that. But the threat is real, and so we go back to the drawing board and ask, what is in your experience a leaderful action you can take? Can you make house meetings so that we can continue to do know your rights training? Can you train other people? Can we support you in building capacity to teach others on things that are important to you? And so the public action is one of the many public leadership opportunities that any regular person can experience. My suggestion, my invitation is, how are you exploring a menu of public action that can be accessible for people, even if we know that the risks that we need to take are greater because the stakes are very high, but also the nervous system is not going to be ready when we want it, or when the struggle wants it. The nervous system works in a very individualized condition. And so this is important as organizers to think, yes, about the macro and about the teams, but also think about the person that is facing these challenges and what's in their way. And like having a one-to-one conversation about, what are you afraid of? I understand this is happening. What will look like? I know you deeply care about this. What will be a courageous action that you can take on this for your own agenda, for your benefit, your self-interest today? And how can we support you doing that?
Okay, thank you.
Such a powerful way to close there, Emilia, in terms of that. And let's close, because we told the speakers that they could also leave at the hour with a just gigantic thank you to both Emilia and Silky for taking their time. Incredible leadership and wisdom, and this is hopefully the first of more cross-border learning sessions where we can also invite leaders from campaigns in other parts of the world who have lessons for all of us. We're going to be sending out a recording of this, a reflection, and ways to follow up and take action, including campaigns that Silky and Emilia are working on, and also how to connect with Belonging Beyond Borders and the other organizations who are present today. So please share this recording with people who you think can benefit from it. Share the memo with organizers who you think could benefit from it. And as the one kind of take action for today, we just invite you to sign up for our newsletter so we can keep in touch with you and let you know when we're having more opportunities like this to connect. So with that, goodbye and thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good
Yeah,
day.
thank
you.
you. It was
Bye.
great to be here. Great to
Thank
connect with you
you.
all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks
Bye.
so much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.